My personal journey as Carson's biographer is a journey I never thought possible, had no anticipation of. And as an environmental historian, it never occurred to me that this is where I would end my journey in environmental history. It's been a very mysterious and a very wonderful journey and very enriching. So thank you once again for being here, and thank you, Lisa, for having me. As you all know, I've spent a good deal of my life thinking and writing about Rachel Carson. Rachel and I grew up several generations apart in the rugged hills above the Allegheny River, just north of Pittsburgh. I didn't know of our geographical and environmental commonality when I started researching her life, nor did I know that her mother and my grandmother were members of the same Presbyterian women's circle, or that Rachel's best friend in college and fellow scientist, Dorothy Seif, had been my biology teacher in high school. She never walked in the room and said, "Girls, I was Rachel Carson's best friend in college." She said some other things when she walked in that room, but that wasn't all. There are some signs of synchronicity that I believe as a biographer, and I believe in strongly. So when I also discovered that the same area where my parents built a small home north of the one they had lived in my childhood, it was the very site of the wildflower field trips that Miss Skinker, Carson's biology teacher at Chatham, had taken her students, including Rachel, to see and to observe native plants. When I found this out, I said to myself, "Linda, I think you're supposed to write this book." Dedication is one quality that all biographers have, because it's a long and lonely hunt for evidence and for understanding your victim. We can never, never, ever, ever get it right, of course, but we must try to come as close as possible. My biography of Carson has been widely acclaimed, but it has also been criticized for not being critical enough of Carson or of her accomplishment. Perhaps, but I did not and do not think her Saint Rachel. She was a very human person, and her life was both tragic and triumphant, which is what I hope to know and to show. Carson was once demeaned as a woman who loved cats and whose science or opinions shouldn't be taken seriously. On a personal level, Carson was a failure as a surrogate mother for her niece's son, whom she adopted in 1951. Rachel never wanted to be a mother. Rachel didn't know how. Rachel was the family breadwinner, almost always, and always poor, and always short of money. Realistically, she had to write and to get published, and she couldn't write and work full-time at the Fish and Wildlife Service. Few reporters or critics realized that after she left government service, economically and legally, she was vulnerable, totally vulnerable, with no institutional protection and with an aging mother and a small son to support. So even embarking on a book like Silent Spring, but even on the sea books, was a remarkable achievement and courage. She had to take a big risk. Maybe times weren't quite as litigious back then in the 50s and early 60s, but by the time Silent Spring was published, she certainly was vulnerable. And yes, she was a single-minded, determined, unrelenting woman, but what prophet has not been such? And I believe Carson was a prophetic voice, which is reflected in my title, Witness for Nature. Carson was prescient and prophetic. Few writers of our contemporary life have been so. She really was fearless. She understood too much. She accomplished too much. She foresaw too much potential harm and potential beauty, and she loved too much, as most prophets do. So let me give you some biographical background And let me apologize, I have been diagnosed, unfortunately, with low vision, so I struggle up here. But bear with me. Carson was well educated, curious, a curious biologist, and an exceptionally observant naturalist from childhood. She was not a laboratory scientist and never pretended to be. But because today's readers identify her almost exclusively with Silent Spring, they ignore the scientific significance and timelessness of her earlier massive work on the seas. And I can think of no better day to talk about Rachel Carson's work on the seas than this past week and several weeks with hurricanes upon us. She was, in my view, and in the view of many, one of the best synthesizers of scientific information that the 20th century has ever seen. Before Silent Spring, that talent was best illustrated and I'm on the committee to get rid of that, too. Her talent was best illustrated in The Sea Around Us, published in 1951, which incorporated the new oceanic and climate research from World War II. The sea made Carson the public voice of science in the United States and a world literary figure. We forget that. It was followed perhaps by a lighter but equally prescient book about climate and the unpredictable marriage of sea and shore, The Edge of the Sea, in 1955. Readers saw her as a woman who knew a great deal, but she had trouble with some of her male scientists who just could not believe that a female could have written The Sea Around Us, that no woman could know that much science and incorporate it into a book. And Shirley, in her incredible wit, Shirley Briggs, did a poster, or a painting, Nate, I'm sure remembers this, of Rachel as her readers saw her. And it was Rachel depicted as a sea monster coming up out of the half shell with tentacles and octopus-like structures, and this was Rachel as her readers saw her. During these years, and perhaps most significant of all, Rachel Carson's belief in the immutability of the earth and the sea and the natural world was utterly shaken by the impact of the atomic bomb in 1945 and the atomic era which followed. She came to believe that she had witnessed the human potential for the destruction of all life, reluctant as she was to admit it. Perhaps because she was raised a Calvinist, she inherited an innate sense of human fallibility and pessimism about the human ego. Fear for the destruction of life became a controlling motif in all her subsequent thinking and writing. The thesis of my biography is that Rachel Carson was one of the most determined and courageous people that have ever contributed to our times. There were so many points at which Carson could have chosen an easier path, a different one. She could have declined. She did not. She was determined to be a writer when she was an undergraduate and poor. She was determined to discover all she could about the effects of the sea and land and life, and then obsessed with the possibility of the impact of synthetic chemical pesticides on the biota. She was determined to complete Silent Spring, even though she knew on some level that it would probably be her last book and that she was dying. She wanted to write a book on ecology, which I've always found fascinating. That was to be her next book, a big book, she described it, on ecology and the whole lot of life. So while I respect those readers who think I was too lenient in my analysis of her life and work, I maintain that Rachel Carson was much more than a writer of seminal works on natural history. Rather, she was that prophetic voice that intrinsically understood that all life, her life, our lives, the planet's future, depended upon respect, cooperation, and balance. And she was consumed with the fear that humans, with their egos and their greed and their insistence to have it now were armed with a new and terrible science which would be the potential destroyer of worlds. Being such a prophetic voice was not easy, and her message was not a happy one, which emanated from her many friends and readers. She wished she had a happier message. She didn't. So for this audience here at Wood End today, I want to briefly talk about 3 important friends who stuck by her, who helped her and supported her, and without whom Silent Spring may never have been completed or certainly defended. I hope someone will ask me about some of the others. Some of you may live near or in the Chevy Chase, Bethesda area neighborhoods where 2 of Rachel's friends lived even before she built her house out in Berwick Road in Silver Spring. The late Shirley Briggs lived at 7509 Honeywell Drive off Wilson Lane. And the late Jeanne Davis gardened at 4223 Leland Street in Chevy Chase. Shirley and Jeanne both died in 2004, and both were central to Rachel's life, to her ability to write Silent Spring and to my ability to write Witness for Nature. The other friend is the late Roland Clement of New Haven, Connecticut, who died just 2 years ago in August at 102. As a naturalist, explorer, and environmental advocate, he deserves our attention. He was not only important in stopping the manufacture and use of DDT, but he was a major player in the Environmental Defense Fund and a brilliant advocate for the environment. Rachel and I were introduced in 1991. All 3 of these friends feature in the 1993 PBS American Experience video, which is for sale and from which these pictures are taken. It's the only PBS video that has interviews with her friends who actually helped her with her writing and with the whole ordeal of Silent Spring. And that's why I like it. I was a mere historical consultant to that film, but I think it's still by far and away the best. I certainly like and appreciate the latest PBS film, but it was a quite different film with a quite different point of view. And none of the people who knew and worked with Rachel are still alive. So that's why I always recommend the 1993 version if you want to see the people who really made the story happen. I also brought a little painting on the desk over there with those pretty flowers of a bird by Roland Clement, who he gave to me a couple years ago. He was a wonderful watercolor artist and a great birder whose real sadness in life was losing a good bit of his hearing, and understandably frustrated because he couldn't hear the birds as well as he had wanted to. So if we could go back to Shirley a minute. I don't know whether we can do that. Yeah. Shirley Briggs was born in Iowa City in 1918, the only child of John Briggs, a professor of political science at the University of Iowa. Shirley was the last art student of Grant Wood, the famous American painter known for his depictions of rural life, especially the painting The American Gothic. Some of you would know that. Shirley absorbed his style and technique. After getting a master's in botany and a master's in art, Shirley came east when the war started and found a job as an industrial artist for the Glenn McConnell Airplane Factory in Baltimore. She drew plans of airplane parts so that crews would know which side to oil and which side to gas. After 2 years there, she was hired as an artist at the Department of Interior and thereby became a colleague of Rachel Carson's at the Fish and Wildlife Service. Briggs was a founding member of the Audubon Naturalist Society of the District of Columbia and became the editor of its magazine, The Nuthatch, later renamed The Atlantic Naturalist. And she and Rachel and some of the other members of the society were its main writers throughout those early years. They kept the society alive with bird walks and with friendship of other naturalists like Roger Torrey Peterson and Edwin Way Teal, who name a few, who came to Washington to work during the war. Briggs painted several of the dioramas in the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. Unfortunately, they have just now been removed for new ones. And the murals of the U.S. Park Service at the Jamestown Museum, which I think are still up. For over 40 years, she taught natural history at the USDA's graduate school, and her students loved her. After Carson's death, Briggs was the founding member and executive director of the Rachel Carson Council, established in 1956 to continue Rachel's work on pesticides. Roland Clement was also a founding member. The RCC offices were, for many years, as I've said, here at Wood End on the second floor. Briggs is the author of the still essential The Basic Guide to Pesticides, a monumental work which was finished with Nate Irwin's help in 1992. Artist and avid birder, travel companion, government colleague, naturalist, photographer, a genius, really, and a friend from mid-40s to Carson's death. Briggs and Carson initially bonded over a natural love of birding in Cleveland Park. Briggs drew amusing cartoons of Carson's research trips. Several of them are published in my book. And her diaries record their naturalist adventures together to places like Hawk Mountain, Chincoteague, and Parker River Wildlife Refuges for the Fish and Wildlife Service. Briggs illustrated two of Carson's most famous Fish and Wildlife Service publications, Conservation in Action. She accompanied Carson to the Florida Keys, to Myrtle Beach, and when Carson was writing The Sea Around Us, The Edge of the Sea. She was devoted to Rachel and shared and advised her in her political campaign following the publication of Silent Spring. I got to know Shirley by accident at ANS as a camp mother in the early 1980s. With my time on my hands and as an environmental historian, I volunteered at the Rachel Carson Council offices upstairs, having no idea what I was getting into. So when some years later I embarked on the biography, Shirley became my primary source of who, what, and how to proceed. Shirley appears in the first PBS film in 1993, where she speaks eloquently and very humorously of their friendship. She speaks of Rachel's family and her mother, and of Rachel's work habits. She entrusted me with her two voluminous diaries of personal correspondence with Rachel, which sometime I hope to edit and publish. Shirley was steadfast, a friend, a sharp-tongued and sharp-eyed critic, and an advocate, a brilliant naturalist, and devoted to the cause. She deserves a great biography. Her papers are at the Iowa Women's Archive at the University of Iowa, and I sure hope somebody will tackle it. It's a mountain of material. Jeanne Davis now. Jeanne Vance Davis, 1915 to 2004, was hired as Rachel's part-time secretary and editor and administrative aide in the fall of 1959, when Betty Haney Duff, a college student who had been helping Rachel, went off to medical school. And incidentally, somehow because of the wonderful publicity that you've put out for this talk, I heard from Betty Haney Duff. I haven't heard from her for years. She of course, is acknowledged in the biography, and she was very pleased about that. She wrote to say she never did make it to medical school. That she dropped out and had an interesting career in science, and then became a Presbyterian minister, and just retired from that ministry quite recently. So, and Betty will be now featured on my Rachel Carson website, because she's writing a little bio about herself. I was so glad to hear from her. Betty Haney was saddled with going originally to the offices of the different government science offices and trying to get information on their use of chemical pesticides. Pretty soon, they found out that she was working for Rachel Carson and that she wasn't just a grad student, and they wouldn't let her in. So when she went off to school in 1959, she'd just about gone through all the things that she could do to actually help Rachel get information out. That's a whole nother story about the people who helped her, some risking their careers in government to smuggle research material out to Rachel, and why they did it. Anyway, it's not an exaggeration to say that when Jeanne came along, Carson was months behind in her research and way off her deadline, which was the summer of 1960. It is not an exaggeration to say that without Davis, Silent Spring would never have been finished. Jeanne was a native of Nebraska. She married Burnett Davis, who became a public health physician in D.C. She graduated from Doane College in Nebraska and got an MA in economics at Berkeley. While her husband was in medical school at Harvard, Jeanne took a secretarial course at Simmons College in Boston. Then she got jobs at Harvard Medical School as a research assistant to several Harvard scientists, including the physicist Leo Szilard. She was editing their papers, and she knew medical terminology, she knew research sources, and she knew texts. She was also a fine pianist, a wide reader of literature, and much more broadly educated than Rachel. Davis and her two children had a wide range of Chevy Chase friends and social contacts in the arts and sciences, and Jeanne was also a master gardener, a wonderful gardener. Jeanne already knew the writings of Rachel Carson when she read the ad that Rachel had posted in the paper and applied for the job. She was also beautiful, elegant, and generous. As Rachel wrote happily to her editor, Paul Brooks, quote, "If I had set out to make someone up, I could hardly have done better," unquote. When Jeanne was hired, Rachel was, as I said, months behind in her deadline. Jeanne was horrified at what she had to do to get it done. But with her help, Carson's medical research picked up. Jeanne got a carrel over at the library at NIH, and she and Dorothy Algar, another local friend and scientist of Rachel's, began working at NIH on weekends and evenings. They went to work, spending days doing bibliography, abstracting articles, secreting things out of the library, copying them, and returning them secretly the next morning. Yeah, it'd be very hard to get away with that today. It was evident to Rachel, as it was to Hooper, Bishkin, and Hargraves, the chief medical oncology and chemical researchers at NIH, connected with NIH, that there was an incontrovertible link between cancer and chemical pesticides, and that they had been used so prolifically in the post-World War, when the demands for immediate solutions, the quick fix, were what the public demanded and the government sold. As Rachel got sicker, more work fell to Davis. She took dictation and read back to her when Rachel was blinded for months on end with iritis. Later, Davis took Carson to her daily chemo appointments at Washington Hospital Center, looked after Roger, screened calls, made appointments, and kept the manuscript going. Without Davis, as I said, Silent Spring would never have had the sound scientific underpinnings that allowed it to stand the withering attacks that it received after it was published in 1962. Davis was an essential part of the agony and the brilliant achievement that was Silent Spring. But as Davis, always graciously self-effacing, said in the PBS video, quote, "She was simply given the gift of watching join the coalition that's after these guys. There's a meeting Thursday night at the Brookside Church in Glen Echo of the coalition that's really battling the FAA in this, and we're part of it. and they're doing a great job. I always thought it was just bothering us at night and during the day outside. I've never tried to give a speech through it, so I'm going to write a new note to them. Yeah, over a bird sanctuary, too. Jeanne always said, quote, she was simply given the gift of watching a major work of literature come to life, and always downplayed her own contribution to it. My relationship with Jeanne Davis started from 1991 till Davis's death in 2004 at age 89. She was a marvelous person, and it was a marvelous gift to be her friend. She opened many doors for me, including to Paul Brooks, Carson's publisher. She was, in fact, a sort of surrogate mother for me, who kept encouraging me after my own mother died in 1994. And the next friend is Roland Clement. Roland was born in 1912 and died, as I said, in 2015 at 102. My great friend and mentor, Roland, after Roland died, I haven't been able to put up a in memoriam on the website for him. It's just been too close. I haven't been able to quite bring myself to do it yet, but it will come. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to tell you about this lesser-known friend of Rachel's in this very supportive setting. Clement was a lifelong birder, a passionate one, and then he shared with Rachel and with Shirley. He played a key role in the banning of DDT in 1972, and thereafter worked tirelessly for the Environmental Defense Fund. When Rachel reached out to him, Roland was the vice president of National Audubon Society, a position he held for 2 decades. It is ironic that Clement left Audubon in the late 1960s after a vituperative lawsuit was filed against him by one of Carson's most vicious critics, Thomas Jukes. I think we have a picture of Tom Jukes, so if you advance a little ahead, yeah. No, Tom Jukes, go back. Go back. That's Tom Jukes. Hold on to that for a minute. Jukes. He's an academic at Berkeley, a scientist, biologist. He was also an industry spokesman and a nutritionist. And many of you probably don't know the role that the Nutrition Foundation played in trying to suppress silent spraying and being against Carson. We always think of the Nutrition Foundation as good guys. In this case, they were very bad guys. Roland was sued by Tom Jukes and left Audubon after that vituperative lawsuit. Now we can go back to Roland. Roland was born in Fall River, Massachusetts in 1912. At the age of 8, he locked eyes for a few minutes with the male black and white warbler. After that, he wrote, "I was hooked for life." He got one of his first Eagle Scout badges in ornithology, banded birds on Cape Cod while serving during World War II, and as a weatherman in Nova Scotia, his interest and passion increased in birds, migration, exploration, and where they went. He studied wildlife management at the University of Massachusetts. He earned a BA as a serviceman in botany and geology at Brown University, and then a master's degree at Cornell. He joined National Audubon in 1958, helping to conserve the whooping crane, the bald eagle, and the peregrine falcon, and the California condor. And as a result of his own research, he was really on to the fact that pesticides were the cause of the loss of these sorts of birds. Rachel sought him out for his expertise on the impact of pesticides on wildlife, and particularly on gallinaceous birds. Ironically, they shared the same initials, RC. Clement consulted with her on her evidence and read Silent Spring in draft. When the National Audubon Society refused to publish any chapters of her book in its official Audubon magazine after publication in 1962, Roland went on the road as her chief ecological defender. He debated the dreaded Robert White Stevens of Velsicol 3 times. And I think we can go to there. When I show the PBS movie with Robert White Stevens, who was Velsicol's chief spokesman, Velsicol being the big chemical company, he was an industry scientist, my students would just howl. They think of him as he couldn't be for real. It was kind of a doctor, spooky guy. He was spooky, but he was very bright and not to be snuffed at all, although he sounded like it. And there was wonderful footage in the PBS video of him speaking about why and how Rachel was so wrong. Roland told me that he lost the first 2 debates with Robert White Stevens, but won big on the 3rd one. Some of this is shown, as I said, in the PBS documentary, and I hope you'll look. Clement testified before the Senate in 1963, immediately after Rachel Carson's own testimony, and he defended her thesis the rest of his long life. He was also a founding member of the Rachel Carson Council. I benefited from his friendship from 1991 until his death, and I do miss him terribly. His papers were donated to the Lear Center, and he too deserves a very, very special biographer. I'll leave you and this review of Carson's Friends with a Clementian quote from 1962. Roland wrote on his blog, a wonderful blog, quote, "An almost religious humility in man's relation to his environment is needed today when insecticides and technological manipulation and implementation goes without full knowledge of their ecological impacts as a result of impatience and arrogance." Clement used to paint, continued to paint, and continued to watch birds and to create a blog which was going strong just before he died at 102. I always had to run to catch up with him, and he was my mentor and friend and had one of the most brilliant minds I've ever encountered. My life is very much poor for his loss. So here are 3 of Rachel Carson's friends: Shirley Briggs, Jeanne Davis, and Roland Clement, friends that we don't hear enough about. Each was devoted to her. Each was devoted to the things she loved, devoted to the message of Silent Spring. They each made a significant difference and impact on her life. Without them, I believe Carson's history and the history of Silent Spring would be far different. Certainly my life and experience as a biographer would never have been as full or as wonderful or as successful. Thank you very much. Questions, please. I'm delighted.
What's with Cleveland Park? There's some photographs of Rachel, the photo op. But
Right.
What was the connection? That isn't near the Fish and Wildlife offices, is it?
No, well, A&S was a participant in that, in the Cleveland Park, but it's really Shirley and her friends started the Christmas bird count in Cleveland Park. And I don't know what other organizations joined in that then, but it was a multi-organizational undertaking. But Shirley was really the leading light of that, and Rachel joined in. Yeah. And that photo op was staged, in Cleveland Park because of that. Yes, Nate.
I remember in high school reading the brand new Paul Brooks literary biography of Carson, and I don't know much about their relationship, and I didn't know how much you knew about him being another colleague friend.
Yes, I should have. I could have included Paul Brooks indeed in. He was a very big, important person in her life. Brooks was head of Houghton Mifflin, the editor-in-chief of Houghton Mifflin, and as such, he was the editor for many, many wonderful books on nature and wildlife. He was a naturalist himself. He wrote several books not on birds, but including birds, but on the environment. He and Rachel hit it off almost immediately as soon as Marie Rodell, Rachel's agent, him. And he loved Silent Spring. He didn't love her first title. And at this point, I can't remember what her first title was, but it was pretty bad. It was pretty, well, that was one they were tinkering with, Man Against Nature. But there was one that had the word death in it, and Paul didn't like that one at all. Paul wrote an autobiographical piece, too, of his own writing as a naturalist, own adventures as a naturalist. He was an elegant Harvard grad, Bostonian. He was married to Sally, to a wonderful woman. They had two delightful daughters. He lived in Lincoln, Massachusetts, and was Harvard from the tip of his head to the bottom of his feet. So they were very different. They were very different people from very different kinds of backgrounds. But he, of course, thought the sea around us was wonderful, and thought the edge of the sea was wonderful, and he couldn't wait to get Rachel. And he was instrumental in getting Silent Spring also published by the New Yorker when it first came out in the 3-part series that it did. When Rachel died in 1964, she left no provision, especially for her adopted son, Roger. She could not bring herself to figure out how to do it. So there was a very tense period of negotiation of where was Roger going to go and where was Roger going to be raised and how was he going to be brought up. She had hoped that the Freemans, her dear friends in Sheepscott, would take Roger because they had a daughter who was not far off from Roger's age. But I think Dorothy and Stan already knew what a difficult task that would be, and how expensive it would also be. And he was a college professor, and wasn't quite willing to take that on. So Paul Brooks and his wife stood up and took Roger, and raised him. And actually, it was Sally who really raised him because Paul went off to Boston, to Cambridge every morning and went to work. And Roger did indeed turn out to be quite a handful, as you can imagine, a child who was sort of dislocated and put off, and he had all kinds of rights to be. Happily, he's a very happily married man these days with 2 sons, or 3, I can't remember, 2, I believe it, and is a documentarian and does computer business. His wife was a friend of Paul's and was in Greenpeace, so he still keeps up with that. And he still has Rachel's cottage in Booth Bay, so which you can rent through Roger. And he serves as the honorary chairperson today of the Rachel Carson Council, which is a lovely, circuitous way back to his origins. Other questions? Or did I finish, Nate? Did I? Okay. And that was Paul's contribution, and I must say, Paul and I met and got on particularly well because of Jeanne Davis, who laid the groundwork for that. But he was, as soon as, my problem with writing the book was that Rachel's estate, Marie Rodell's agent, who became the literary agent, they did not want a biography of Rachel Carson. They did not want one for a variety of personal reasons. They thought it would be too personal and too revealing and too. So when my publisher approached them to open the papers, they said no. And they were charging some outrageous amount of money to quote Carson. So the scholarly community that I was involved in, who had written some books using Carson, could only afford to quote in small paragraphs because they were charging $50 a line. So no academic could write anything. And you can't write about a literary figure of Rachel's status and stature if you can't quote. So that put an end to that. So it was by going around thanks to Shirley and Jeanne and Paul and a woman named Ruth Scott in Pennsylvania, that I got into the people who knew Rachel, who finally said to the literary agent, "You got to let this woman publish this book." And that's how it happened. That's how permission was finally granted. It was from the inside out, not the outside in. Yeah.
It's a friendship question.
Sure.
I can understand certainly the strong professional friendships that created. Could you talk a bit about the capacity for the personal friendships that came among these people?
Rachel made good friends at Fish and Wildlife. There's another woman who another artist like Shirley, who accompanied her on trips, who became a great friend. I think the capacity was in sharing naturalist trips. They went to Hawk Mountain together. They took Audubon tours together. They went to the beaches together, and they were involved in Audubon Naturalist Society. Rachel had some friends from the outside, from other areas of her life, but after she left government service, her world was more subscribed because she wasn't involved in outside things, with the exception of Audubon. She was too engrossed in trying to get information, trying to be research, and trying to do all this on her own, and still write enough short stuff to make enough money to keep going. So that's a very good question. Then that's where Dorothy Freeman comes in. Dorothy being Stan Freeman, and Dorothy lived in Booth Bay Harbor at the end of the road where Rachel's cottage was when she was able to buy that cottage after the sea around us, which made her a good substantial amount of money, so that she was able to do some things that she'd never been able to do before with her mother. Dorothy also had a mother, and an aging mother, and so Dorothy lived with her mother and Stan, and Rachel lived with her mother. And this, was a big important piece of glue. Dorothy also had children, 2 children. They were a little older than Roger, but it allowed another glue to fit because Dorothy understood children much better than Rachel did, and certainly little boys. Other friendships were either literary and brief, but not sustaining. So, Rachel was really a loner, worked alone, tried to write as she could, and take care of her mother and take care of Roger, and that was enough. A little too much, but that was enough. Bob, did you want to add?
No, I wanted to learn.
Oh.
I've always been curious with Rachel's relationship with Roger Tory Peterson, in my view, how little he makes of her, having converted, served on the board, etc. Do we know much about their relationship?
No, it's a good question. I don't. And I don't know why Roger Tory Peterson has been less forthcoming. I did not interview him. I think I talked to him maybe on the phone a little bit, but it wasn't what I would call a full-class interview.
I would add that Roger Tory Peterson, who I started with his book,
Right.
and moved on to Jeanne Davis, who I want to ask you about. But Peterson also doesn't give any acknowledgement to Florence Marion Bailey, who's in my book, who was a founder and board member of the early District of Columbia Society that became ANS, and who had a Western Field Guide, won the Brewster Medal. He talks about the guys who wrote, Frank Chapman wrote the Eastern Guide, but not a word of Florence Marion Bailey.
Yeah, I've always suspected that he's a bit of a chauvinist.
Well, there is that. I think it's another word for that.
To be decorous. It's a very good question. I don't know. their relationship in Washington was because Roger Tory Peterson came during the war, and he had, I don't remember what particular office he worked in. Nate, do you remember? I don't remember, but that's how they got together these bird trips. And Rachel and Shirley the Hawkeye was always looking for somebody to write an article for the Naturalist. So, she would grab on to him and get these people to write. Carson had a full-time government job. She was trying to keep body and soul together, so she didn't participate as much in this. And Shirley was, I guess, I've never exactly known, but I think Shirley, when her father and mother died, was fairly was fairly well settled. And so she didn't have to worry about, she worked for a long time at different museums and painted and things, but she really didn't have to worry about a paycheck every month. She sold her art. She was a wonderful artist. Her photography she sold, and then she did bits and pieces of, and she got money from teaching the class for the government, but it was not a living wage, you could say. So, but to answer your question, I think, and it's not the same with the other person you just mentioned, Chad Robbins. You want to say a word about Chan, who just passed? No, I don't know.
Well, he was at the Tucson Research Center involved with the DDT investigations. I knew.
Did you know him?
No. I missed all these people. That's
Okay.
why I know you.
Yeah. I met Chan Robbins, and he worked at Patuxent, and he was one of the ones who was doing the field trials on DDT with gallinaceous birds. And Rachel and he exchanged papers, and Rachel edited some of his papers, so they became quite good friends. He was a very good friend of Shirley's. He was in her house a lot, met her friends. These are birding people, and he was in Patuxent at the time when they were just starting those studies on feeding DDT to different kinds of birds, and the bird's eggs softening theories. He also worked under the woman, his name is going to escape me, who for a while was very much opposed to Carson's thesis and work. I can't remember her name at the moment, but she was the head honcho, and he worked under her. He just died, and there's a bio of him on my website that we've just gotten put up. It was written by one of his very good friends who worked in Fish and Wildlife with him. Rachel tried, as all of you know, and those of you who've read my book know, Rachel tried to write an article on DDT and the experiments that were going on at Patuxent in 1954, and was turned down royally. No, people wouldn't be interested in it. Housewives would not read it. It was too scary. No. So it wasn't, no, it was not, it was before 1950. 46, thank you, 1946. It's way early when the experiments were just starting. So she was on to DDT because she was seeing all this research that was coming out of Patuxent and across her desk. That was her job, to edit it. And so she essentially was the clearinghouse. So it was in her DNA, if you will, for quite a while before she finally came to do something about it. I've gone on far too long. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You may have done some of this in the beginning of your talk, but I wondered if you would describe Rachel Carson's personality.
Whew. Well, I never met her. The closest I can get to that is an example of my own insecurity. I remember quite vividly once sitting in Jeanne Davis's sunroom, and I don't know where I was, and I was definitely towards the end of the writing. And I said to her out of the blue, sort of, Jeanne, do you think Rachel would have liked me? Talking about the insecurities of the writers, right? And Jeanne said, oh, yes, she would have, indeed. And then she went on to expand why. But Rachel was there's a picture of Rachel and Dorothy I think it's in my book, sitting on a sofa in Booth Bay. With Rachel, you know, her body language is all inward and it's all tucked in and her arms are folded and she's sort of very prissy. And Dorothy, this expansively affectionate woman who would hug a frog. I mean, she was, this is a woman who called everybody darling and who wrote thousands of letters to her college and high school friends for years and years and years. She was effusive and outwardly affectionate from the tip of her toes to the top of her head. They couldn't have been more different. And that's why they got along, because, you know, it was only with somebody who was so over the top that Rachel would be able to come forth a little bit. So her personality was naturally shy. Her college roommates describe her as shy. She was quiet. She was a loner. She was poor. She didn't have a lot of friends because she didn't have a lot of money. She couldn't go and get sodas. She was a depression child. She had an overbearing mother who never wanted her to get married, and who probably just sort of tolerated Shirley, although Shirley would kind of tell her off, I think. But Shirley also had an aging mother. You know, so, and this is a kind of a, you know, this was a generation of women that took care of their aging mothers and often had them live together and, you know, shared the hardship of what that's like intergenerationally. Does that help?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. One more.
Who would you say, or what groups would you say are carrying forth Rachel's legacy?
Well, there are two in this room. Aside from the Rachel Carson Council and the Audubon Naturalist. The history of Rachel Carson groups has been fraught. There were people in Pittsburgh who worked very hard to buy and save Rachel's house, the Carson family home, which was nothing more than a tiny little, practically a log cabin with an attached kitchen. They were very poor. Her father was never able to hold down much of a job, and her mother taught piano lessons, and you know, it was hard scrabble life. And they weren't very popular in Springdale because I think Robert Carson left town with some debts when Rachel went to graduate school at Hopkins. But the homestead, the Rachel Carson homestead, still operates, and it still owns the home, and it does some naturalist tours and some good trail making and things in the Pittsburgh area. That was one of the earliest. There was a Rachel Carson Institute that was set up at Chatham University, Chatham College then, but they've never had a real sense of direction. Patty DeMarco, who was the head of the homestead for a number of years, and is a real go-getter, and is coming out with an environmental book on Pittsburgh and on environmental sustainability this fall, soon, should be out. She was head of the Rachel Carson Homestead and then head of the Rachel Carson Institute at Chatham, but it lacked money and it hasn't ever had quite a sense of direction. So I think, and there's this group in Germany who calls themselves anyway, there's a group in Germany who've taken the name. I don't know how they got permission to do that, and they bring scholars over to it's in Munich, and they bring scholars over, and they don't necessarily study Rachel or the environment, but it's under that rubric. And then there's the Rachel Carson Council, which has now gone through a number of changes and happily is in fit top form and going strong, thanks to Bob and Lisa. So I don't know of any others. Anybody else? Quick? Yeah.
As a follow-up, you talked a lot about the federal government not being too eager to pursue research on pesticides. Do you have any sense of what the federal government or state agencies are, who's sort of the cutting edge or not the cutting edge?
Now?
Now.
Oh, boy. That's a very good question, and how long do we have? you know that the EPA has just avoided and voided the research on the pesticide Lotraban that is known to cause damage to children and to field workers. It's a mess. I mean, it's just an awful mess. And I don't think I don't know where it will all end. I don't think the money is pouring into new oil wells and not into pesticide research or even agricultural research.
So write your congressman.
Write your congressman, yeah. Okay, I want to thank Lisa, I want to thank A&S and your attention.